And we're in the company of former U.S. Ambassador to Finland, Charles Adams, here by the banks of Lake Geneva in this special edition. When you watch that report, you ask yourself the question, throughout the press conference, we heard Joe Biden asking aloud what is in Russia's interest. Is it in Russia's interest to cooperate on this issue of cybersecurity with the United States?
Very much so. Very much so. I think the message that President Biden communicated is that cybersecurity is in the joint interests of Russia and the United States.
Because this is where we get into a gray area, right? You have, on the one hand, the fact that these we don't know because we're not investigators, cyber criminals. U.S. says they're operating from Russian territory. It's not the Russian state as such that's responsible. So we're in this gray zone. So is it in Vladimir Putin's interest to cooperate fully with the United States, or to use Cold War parlance, make mischief?
Again, it's not my position nor that of President Biden to counsel President Putin. I think that President Putin will wish to contemplate what is the reality, namely that when it comes to capacity and capability in matters of cyber aggression or cyber interference, there is a drastic asymmetry between the capability of the United States and that of Russia. And President Biden did make it clear that in the event of a cyber attack traceable directly or indirectly to Russia, that there would be appropriate response and a measured response. And I think that in this he was believed by President Putin.
Believed by President Putin. One final question for you. We had the U.S. press pose questions to Vladimir Putin, quite a few of them. We didn't hear from the Russian media asking questions to Joe Biden. You sorry about that we didn't hear from the Russian press?
Oh, I expect that one will be reading about all of this in the Russian press. My understanding from listening to President Biden is that there had been an invitation to the Russian press to submit questions, and for whatever reason, there was a less interventionist attitude, shall we say.
Because now, after the summit's over and everyone starts to pack up, it's how it's all put through the ringer and put into little clips on social media, and the Russians are pretty good at that.
Well, so too are the Americans, actually, when they put their mind to it. So both sides are going to be spinning this through the channels of communication that are available to them, including social media.
All right. Thank you very much. Charles Adams, former ambassador to the United States. Thanks for being with us here on France 24.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So there you hear it. We've had the two press conferences today. This summit, which attracted the world's media. By the way, we're, just in case you're joining us on France 24, on the other side of Lake Geneva. It's in behind that marina is where the summit took place at the Villa La Grange. We can now bring in Thomas Greminger, director for the Center for Security Policy, former deputy director of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you for joining us here on France 24.
A pleasure to be with you tonight.
So, I should say Ambassador Greminger.
That's okay. And I was the former Secretary General of the OEC. So for 3 years, between 17 and 20, I was the Secretary General of the OEC, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Yes.
All right, before we broach the OSCE, Geneva's the center of the world. Your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think once more Geneva proves to be a good venue for a summit. And now, after listening to two press conferences, I would come to a cautiously positive, optimistic assessment.
cautiously optimistic assessment. Translate that for us.
Look, as President Biden just said, we'll see within a period of 6 months if all those areas that the two presidents now have identified as areas of converging interests, as areas where they would want to cooperate despite of all the divergences, despite of a certainly continued relatively confrontational overall climate in bilateral relations, if they will yield positive outcomes. He mentioned talks, institutionalizing a dialogue about strategic stability, I think very important. Cyber was mentioned. Rather surprisingly for me that cyber was mentioned as an area where they really want to cooperate.
Yeah, it sounds like a start there, not a finish.
Absolutely. But I'm not surprised that they have now agreed on bilateral expert talks to identify red lines, critical infrastructure that is just out of bounds for attacks. And as a matter of fact, the Russians have always asked for bilateral expert talks on cyber with the Americans, and they have never gotten it. Now, I think President Biden is ready to go along, at least for a pilot test phase.
Because he wasn't before?
Well, before there was a lot of multilateral discussions ongoing. There were a number of agreements in the cyber domain. For instance, talking about the OSCE 16 confidence building measures were agreed, but okay, they were never really seriously implemented. So agreeing now on bilateral expert talks to identify red lines, I think that's a positive step forward. But again, we will have to see if this will yield positive results.
Whether it'll yield positive results. And of course, when you think about the OSCE, you think of the job that your former organization does in trying to stop the bloodshed in Ukraine by monitoring what goes on both sides. Both presidents were asked about Ukraine.
With regards to commitments to Ukraine, we have one single commitment to help and facilitate the implementation of the Minsk agreements. If the Ukrainian side is ready to do that, we are ready to follow this path without any doubts. As for the exercises, we are holding these exercises in our territory, just like the United States does with regard to many drills.
Thomas Greminger, I mean, I translate what Putin says as it's all the West's fault?
Well, basically, when it comes to Ukraine, I think he simply referred to the need to implement the Minsk agreements. That's nothing new. And here, this is also a position the West would agree with. Obviously, the big issue is what does this entail in practice in addressing security-related issues in the Donbass? What does it mean in terms of the political clauses of the Minsk agreements? And here, clearly, we have heard President Biden say that Ukraine was a difficult issue, but that they agreed to pursue diplomatic conversation on it. This is good, but I haven't heard a clue that we are about to progress in implementing.
And would progress come if the United States was included in the current format of discussions that only brings together Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany?
I'm not sure that you want really to change the Normandy 4 arrangement. I think this would complicate matters, and I'm also pretty sure that the Russians would not be interested because this would then put them de facto in a 1 against 4 position, and I think that's not in their interest. However, what is important is that there is a strong U.S. interest in resolving the conflict and that there is a consistent US policy. And US influence on the Ukrainian government, on Kiev, is absolutely key. And I think in that sense, the US has an important role to play.
Was Joe Biden right in the build-up to this summit to invite Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to Washington?
I think this is absolutely key. If the US government wants to play a facilitating role towards conflict resolution, it is important that President Biden is being trusted by both sides. By President Zelensky. If not, Ukraine will never come along, but also be accepted by President Putin.
Thomas Greminger, Director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, former Deputy Director of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
We have reconnected the line there with earlier on we were cut off speaking to Elizaveta Izakova, who is the Geneva correspondent for RIA Novosti, the Russian news agency. Thanks so much for being back with us. Glad the connection is back as well. Elizaveta, your thought on the jousting that we heard, the crossing of swords slightly on issues like Ukraine, like the eventual fate of Alexei Navalny?
Actually, I can say that those were like difficult issues even before the summit. So here we can have no expectations on that these questions should be solved, or these issues would have been solved during the summit. So I think those questions will be left postponed for later to discuss later after we install better our relationship. So for the moment. We, I think, should focus more on the points of commonalities that presidents have found and not on the points that separate both countries. By the way, I can note that the tone of the President Biden's press conference, he was very diplomatic during this press conference, and that means that he, from the United States, from the side of the United States, he already wants to have this connection with Russia, and as Putin noted, there were no hostile environment during this summit. So I think it was quite positive for both countries, and it's better to follow the points of commonalities, the good things that they reached during the summit, and this could be the beginning of something bigger, which we will see maybe in 6 months' time.
Even when, at one point in the press conference, Joe Biden answering a question said the consequences would be devastating if Alexei Navalny died in prison?
Yes, that was quite an answer, but it is true that this question, the question of human rights, it's very important. It's very important for the United States. But in Russia, we also have a lot of questions to the United States about the situation, what happened in January in Washington. So the question of human rights for both countries, it's quite complicated. So you know, we cannot reach an agreement like this after the summit about this. So I think it's normal that both presidents stayed on their own position on this matter, on this issue.
Let me ask you one final question, Elizaveta. The France 24 debate's been to Moscow, and when you're there, you really get the impression that Russians get the West. They understand it. Sometimes it's less so the case here. Did you have that feeling today that the press pack from the West didn't understand Russia as well as the other side?
Well, I can say that I noted that the tone of foreign journalists, Western journalists, were quite strong during the meeting. before we heard the outcomes of the meeting. Because, for example, American journalists, they were talking about Biden coming to lecture Putin. But in my opinion, it was not, it has never been a lecture. It was a bilateral meeting. It was a dialogue between two superpowers. So, as we've seen, because of the statements of the two presidents, now I think the tone of the speech from the Western media will become a little bit less, I can say, aggressive towards Russia.
Elizaveta Izakova, Geneva correspondent for RIA Novosti, thank you so much for speaking with us here in the France 24 debate in this special edition following those two press conferences by Joe Biden and before that Vladimir Putin. We are pleased to welcome and to thank him for his welcome here to his country, Florian Irminger, Secretary General of the Swiss Green Party. How are you?
Good evening. I'm well, thank you.
So I was putting the question to your compatriot Thomas Greminger a short while ago. First off, here we have it, Geneva, the center of the world.
Yeah, some would say that Geneva is used to be the center of the world, but more, seriously, it is important. It's important that these two powers show that multilateralism counts, and symbolically, that is what Geneva stands for.
Multilateralism, how would you compare it? The last time there was a major summit, it was way back in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. This time we'd been prepared with a week of managing expectations downwards during Joe Biden's European tour. Would you say that this one seems as important as because that's what you were telling me earlier, as the one between Reagan and Gorbachev?
In terms of content, at least as important, in terms of the expectations around it, meaning we come out of a period where for 4 years we didn't know what the president of the USA was kind of standing for with Russia. What was he going to do with Putin? Would he hold him accountable for some of the acts? So there was huge expectations. And then for the international Geneva, we're in a period since 9/11 where multilateralism counts less, where you seem like the international law doesn't matter anymore. This is a reaffirmation of the role of Geneva and the place of Geneva in this multilateral world. And so somehow, in terms of expectations, it reaches probably the level of the Gorbachev meeting.
There's all these gray areas nowadays. We were speaking earlier with Beatrice Finn telling us how there's more countries that have nuclear weapons than before. When it comes to cybersecurity, the actors, we never quite know. Are they sponsored by a state or not?
There's more kind of elements you can't control, and there's more invention of new terms. Like Biden today invented something new. There's a predictable relationship with Russia. There's no such thing as a predictable relationship. There's relationship between states based on international law. And I'm saying that from a Swiss perspective, it's really essential, because if states begin inventing new things, how do smaller states exist in this international community? The international rule of law mechanisms that we have, international multilateralism, is the way that states govern their relationships, not sort of new inventions that they create to govern relationships between two countries.
But we heard your compatriot Thomas Greminger, former deputy director of the OSCE, say earlier that it's a good thing that Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin have committed themselves to more bilateral discussions, particularly on that issue of Ukraine. The two-way conversation matters as well.
Of course it matters, but even the two-way conversation should be based on international law. What is happening in Crimea right now, there actually is international law. There is the Budapest Agreement that settles the state of Crimea and the role that Crimea plays within Ukraine. That is settled. The negotiation should be inside this international law. How do we get out of the situation that we're in now? So yes, Thomas Greminger is certainly right to say there should be more bilateral talks. What I'm saying is I hope that this event underlines that multilateralism, the role that all states play in the world, really matters too.
All states in the world. Switzerland's not a member of the European Union, as we know, but it is in the center of Europe. And your thoughts when you hear Putin and Biden talking about the issues like a better management of cybersecurity on a bilateral basis. Again, we're back to this issue of whether you speak one-to-one or in a big group.
And you see there immediately the risks that there are for countries that are part of the international community, but not necessarily part of this bilateral dialogue. So Switzerland welcomed this dialogue, Switzerland hosted it physically, but then it's not part of the dialogue when it is an issue of key concern for a country like Switzerland. If you think of the banking system, if you think of the economic system, all of that is so much at risk in Switzerland from international hacking, yet the discussion happens between two states when it should be an international conversation.
Is there the sense that the U.S. owns the internet and the Russians own the means to perturb it?
Somewhat.
And on this, finally, on this issue of these two old Cold Warriors, right, who sit down in Geneva. Again, we said it earlier, but it's mind-boggling to think about it, that Joe Biden's first trip to the Soviet Union was in 1973. The fact that they now have seen all the mistakes and can check him off, is that a good thing? Or, well, is it time for a new generation to look at these problems?
That's a difficult question. I think what I thought was interesting, you have these two warriors that come in that have seen everything, and yet an issue came up that nobody expected, the protection of the Arctic. And there you go, you have people who symbolize kind of the 20th century and bring up one of the most important issues when it comes to climate change that the future generations will have to face. And if there's one big outcome to take of this meeting is that two, if I may say, elderly men have thought, well, wait a minute, what happens in the Arctic actually matters for the generations down the road. And we need to kind of set in stone that we won't solve that now.
All right, on that positive note, Florian Irminger, I want to thank you for joining us here.
Thank you very much.